this really weird memory from when I was a kid. One day, my cousins pulled up this video on YouTube, back in its glory days. This true story of kids going missing at a pizza arcade place. Now, there was a mascot luring them to the back. The weirdest part is, I can't find this story anywhere, but I know I heard it. And so, I started to do a little digging, and maybe I'm not the only one that's heard this before. Now, I can already hear you yelling at me through the screen. That's just Five Nights at Freddy's. And you're right, if you've played the game at all, dug into any of the lore, that is the story of FNAF. But am I the only one who feels like I heard this Reddit storytelling true story-esque of FNAF before FNAF even existed? My question is, did all of us just hear this true story growing up? Or did FNAF just tap into something that was already in the back of our minds? To understand that, we have to go back a bit. Before Freddy, before games, before creepypasta, before YouTube horror, before all of this, there was the animatronic era. Now, this all started with the Walt Disney Company. Disney built these lifelike animatronics that could talk, blink, move, but for the first time, they almost felt human. But almost is where things get weird. Because when something's almost quite right, we're all left with just this undertone of unsettled. And our brains don't always see that as friendly. It sees it as wrong. Eventually, animatronics left the theme parks. They showed up in places like Chuck E. Cheese or Showbiz Pizza Place. Now, these animatronics weren't up to the same par. They were cheaper, louder, and rougher around the edges. Their movements would stutter, eyes wouldn't track, their audio would even become desync or not work at all. And sometimes, they just sat there staring. But in these places, the animatronics weren't even the creepiest part. It was everything around them, places we weren't allowed to go, these employee-only areas, back rooms, maintenance areas. As a kid, those places felt secret. They felt hidden in a way. And I think our minds might have started filling in the blanks. And this is where it all comes together. Because as kids growing up, we all heard the same warnings. Don't talk to strangers, don't follow anyone, and stay where your parents can see you. And now, we're dropped into a loud, chaotic pizza place with flashing lights, distracted adults, and characters that are meant to make you trust them, especially as a child. And suddenly, that fear isn't supernatural anymore. It becomes possible. Now, before the game, before Scott Coffin gave us something that we could experience, there were stories. These stories don't have a clear origin. They came from many places like early forums or anonymous websites like 4chan, or even Reddit in its early days, and were compiled and even put onto YouTube in horror channels. Each time the story was told just a little bit different, and ultimately bringing us our internet folklore we have today. That is what I believe brought us our modern day FNAF. One of the versions of the story that I kept running into wasn't about kids in general. It was about an employee. Now, of course, this employee wasn't working the night shift, as I'm sure you all were expecting, but a closing shift, and waiting for the building to go quiet. If you've ever been in a place like that, you know how different it is after hours, when it's quiet. The music stops, the lights are dim, everything feels a lot bigger than it did before. According to the story, the characters were supposed to be powered down at this point. standing still, just props on a stage. But one night, while doing the final walkthrough, something felt off. Nothing obvious, nothing dramatic, just off. One of the characters, the main one usually, is facing a different direction than it was before. A thing you can explain away, right? Someone bumped into it, you weren't paying that close of attention. Not a big deal, right? So they ignore it. They finish their last walkthrough, shutting off all the lights. But on the way out, they take one last look up at the stage. And there it is, staring at the door. Not the stage, not the audience, the door. The story never really explains what happens after that. Some say they quit, some say they reported it to a higher up, and some say they refused to work the closing shift ever again. But the detail that stuck with me through reading these is it wasn't that it moved, it's when it moved. Not when anyone was watching, not with cameras, just in between. Stories like that, they're easy to brush off. Our minds play tricks on us, of course, especially at the end of shifts. But the next kind of story, that one is much harder to explain away. This one isn't about animatronics, it's about a suit and a person in it. The way it's usually told is not even creepy at first, just a part of the job. It usually explains that at a place like this, they usually have mascots, something for the kids to meet and greet. They're gonna walk in, take pictures, and be what those kids see and remember. During the day, that's all it is, a costume, just some fun. But the stories usually shift to what happens when that costume's not being used, or at least not for what it was intended for. Supposedly, the suit is kept in the back, not on the stage, not out in the open, but usually behind a couple doors that people have to get through. And in every version I found, there's always someone that notices something off about the suit. It wasn't exactly where it was put last, or a little off from how it's normally put away. But then someone mentioned seeing it out on the floor. But the odd part is, no one was supposed to be wearing the suit that day. At least they weren't assigned to it. But there it is, standing out in the arcade or in a hallway. And when those employees question who's inside, no one seems to know the answer. But the next part of the story is always the most unsettling, because it always involved a kid. Not missing at first, just last seen talking to this character. Usually they're laughing and just following it around. Nothing unusual, that's what it's there for, right? But that's when the questions lie. Who's in the suit? Now, most of the time the stories kind of leave it there. Just a question. And sometimes they discuss how the kid showed back up, or sometimes they don't. But the question that always stuck with me through these stories, it's always, who was in the suit? Because unlike the other stories, these aren't animatronics. They don't glitch. They don't have electronics inside them. There's something that's making a choice. And that's when these stories shift from something more mechanical to something a little bit more real. Something we all fear. But the last story I have for you doesn't necessarily happen during business hours. It's not something that happened while these places were open. It's something that happened after them. These buildings are usually shut down, condemned, and left alone. And most of the time, just forgotten. Well, at least by most. Usually the story starts by somebody getting a little curious and going inside. Maybe it's a group of friends, maybe just one person, maybe even somebody trying to catch something paranormal. But all of them seem to focus on the same thing. Something about this place feels off. It doesn't necessarily feel empty. Now the power's supposed to be off. There's not supposed to be anything or anyone left. The building should be its most quiet, and yet it feels alive. Eventually, they end up on the stage, usually with the characters, and it's very lighthearted and funny. They're talking about how creepy this feels. Some are in parts, some have plastic over them. Until somebody points out one that looks a little less old, a little less dusty than the others. Not clean, just different. Like it was the last one to be powered off. The story never rushes to the next part. They all usually linger. They walk around, check out the rest of the building, do a little bit more exploring, but they usually end up back on the stage. And that one that was a little less dusty isn't in the same position they left it. Again, something you can just explain away. Old mechanics, somebody bumped into it, or they all just didn't remember right. And then we come to where almost all the stories conclude. They go to get out, and the hallways feel longer. They feel like somebody's watching them, but yet there's no footsteps, not a sound. They all seem to conclude the same way though. They leave. Everyone never goes back. But they all never have an explanation to what happened. There is one thing they always will remember. It didn't feel abandoned. Like I said, what makes all of these stories so strange is their unclear origin. No confirmed sources, no direct link back to the first one. Yet they all repeat the details. The stage, the character, and something that just feels off. And in 2014, Five Nights at Freddy's was released. And all of these ideas, all of these fears and unspoken things had a place to live. Not just stories you hear, but a place to experience them. Which raises the weird possibility. Maybe FNAF didn't create this fear. It just gave it a shape. And this to me is where things become really interesting. Because if we break down the first Five Nights at Freddy's game, it's really simple. Just a nighttime guard sitting in an office watching cameras and trying to survive through the night. That's it. However, Scott gives us so much more in tiny little bites, and that's what created the phenomenon of FNAF. The lore is truly what built this game, or maybe the lack of it, because FNAF never gives you the full story. It gives you newspaper clippings, a weird phone call, and a story that just doesn't always quite line up. And that's when something really unique happens. Because it leaves it up to you. Because that's when something beautiful happens. You fill in the blanks. You give the story your own twist, similar to how these stories did on early forums when they were told, heard, and then retold again, because they just continue to grow. Some people will lean into the supernatural of it, and some lean into the human side of it. Some try to piece in timelines, and others just follow the feeling. Now, we've all seen the thousands of videos and the timelines and the storylines and the lore of FNAF, but let's be honest, none of them are 100% right. Because it isn't about the story. It's all a framework that is going to leave it up to you. Maybe that's why FNAF feels so familiar. Because before FNAF ever even existed, we were already doing this. We were taking half-remembered stories of a night guard or kids at a pizzaplex, and we were building our own stories. So FNAF didn't give us something new. It just gave us shapes, a place to experience our own fears. Because the honest truth is, the scariest version of the story is the ones we're gonna create ourselves.